my name's Chris McCabe. I'm a poet. I work as the UK's National Poetry Librarian, and I'm the editor of a number of books, including Poems from the Edge of Extinction, an anthology of poems in endangered languages from around the world. And that's the first in a series, followed by No, Love Is Not Dead, which is an anthology of love poems from around the world, many of which are also in endangered languages. And today I want to talk to you about a particular kind of poem and a particular kind of language. It is the language of visual poetry. And I want to focus on one poem in particular from this book. It's a poem in ancient Greek, which is very, very interesting for a number of reasons, not least because it is the beginning of the tradition of the genre of visual poetry. And I'm going to share with you the poem now because I want to be able to show you what is happening in this poem. Just start this screen. So here you can see the poem is by Simias of Rhodes, who lived roughly 300 BC. And the poem is here in the ancient Greek beneath. The poem is called Wings. And as you can see, it's a shaped poem. It's in the form of a pair of wings. And I'll read to you the translation by J.M. Edmonds. Behold the ruler of the deep-bosomed earth, the turner upside down of the son of Achman, and have no fear that so little a person should have so plentiful a crop of beard to his chin. For I was born when necessity bare rule, and all creatures, moved they in air or in chaos, were kept through her dismal governance far apart. Swift flying son of Cyprus and warlord Ares, I am not that at all. For by no force came I into rule, but by gentle will, persuasion, and yet all alike, earth, deep sea, and brazen heaven bowed to my behest, and I took to myself their old sceptre and made me a judge among gods. So I'm just going to flick back to the original so you can see this poem on the screen. As you've just heard, it's quite a strange love poem. It's an invocation of the Greek god Eros, the love god, but quite unusually, Eros here is depicted with a beard. So he's a boy with a beard. So something quite strange is going on in this poem. I'm going to set myself a few questions to answer over the next few minutes. One is, what made Simias want to create a poem like this in the first place? What was the literary culture that Simias worked in and worked against? Why might he have been tempted to invent something so radically different from the poetry that others were creating? How has Simias's poem been transmitted through the centuries? What does the poem say about love? And is visual poetry a universal language that has the potential to transcend the need for translation? And how are today's artists and poets achieving what Simias set out to do in the digital age? So Simias was not only a Greek poet, he was also a grammarian of the Alexandrian school. Alexandria was in current day Egypt, and at the time it was a cultural centre for the Hellenic and later the Roman periods. It would also hold the Library of Alexander, with a collection of works built on a scale that had never been seen before. The library was built in about 283 BC, so Simias may have lived to see it built, but he certainly lived on that verge of its creation in this centre of learning. We only know what we know of Simias through a few documentary reports or anecdotal accounts of him. The 10th century encyclopedia, the Suda, reports that Simius wrote 3 books of glossae, which are collections of obscure words, and 4 books of miscellaneous poems. His visual poems, however, are regarded by many, like me, as the first works of text-based art. So all we have left of Simius's oeuvre, out of all that work, are the poems, some testimonies, and about 32 fragments. He's not usually included in lists of classic poets from the Alexandrian school, but his visual poems have developed something of a cult following amongst poets and artists. This poem, Wings, is one of 3 visual poems taken from Simius's Technopaegnia. The Greek term Technopaegnia refers to both pattern poems and other forms of poems that are technical displays of virtuosity, but are not always visual in the way that this one is. But it is the Greek word for visual poems, where this form, as I say, was first created. This poem is one of 3 that is gathered in the Greek anthology, the others being axe, which is in the shape of an axe, and egg, which is in the shape of an egg. This has been a valuable resource for scholars, but absolutely the nucleus for subsequent generations of visual poets. So what made Simius want to create a poem like this to begin with? Well, intermediate artist Dick Higgins wrote in the 1970s, the story of pattern poetry is, in fact, not the story of a single development or of one simple form, but the story of an ongoing human wish to combine the visual and literary impulses to tie together the experience of these 2 areas into an aesthetic whole. So what Dick Higgins is saying there is that we as humans have a need to combine the textual and the visual, the separation into separate worlds, whilst necessary and logical in many ways, actually negates an impulse that we have to bring the 2 together in one harmonious whole, as we have in this particular poem. It is worth remembering, I think, that the ancient Greek alphabet developed from the Phoenician alphabet, which in turn had developed from Proto-Sinaitic script, which was pictographic. So if I show you the next slide, here are some inscriptions from the Wadi El Hol stones, which were found in the ancient high desert military and trade route between Thebes and Abydos in the heart of Egypt. So these have been dated to about 1900, 1800 BC. But what is interesting, of course, is that it's a pictographic language. So it's a form of script that is talking about celebration, and it lists or shows details of a child, possibly with some adults dancing. So what we have here is the meaning of the pictograph depicted through its visual equivalent. The meaning, what we read from it and what it shows us are the same thing. Very, very satisfying, I think, and something that's, of course, quite alien to our English alphabet, at least, but certainly is not alien to many, many scripts around the world still. I wonder with Simius's poem if there is an edge still in this stage of Greek culture to feel a satisfaction of the visuality and the textual realms integrating into one. We can see, of course, in Greek culture, it was the center of the reification of language, of logos, of the altar of the word, if you like. And it may explain why Simius's poem was not being collected with the classics of ancient Greek, because perhaps in that climate he worked in, of the Greek Academy, there was something perhaps puerile or even childlike about a poem like this, something which might be understood by anyone who looked at it on some level without needing to be able to read even the Greek language. Um, there's something else interesting about this. It's been suggested that Simius's poem may have been intended to be transcribed on an object as a kind of votive offering. The Greeks in the centuries leading up to this particular period, the Alexandrian school, cultivated this ritualistic way of offering objects up to the gods. They would often be left, for example, at sacred shrines. And of course, this act of shrine making, of votive giving, takes or transforms the inner abstract world of language and thought and makes something physical of it. These were ritualistic and magical practices which we know were aligned with the first civilizations before the religious hegemony, if you like, took hold. And of course, in later years, our past centuries at least, the rational and technological and scientific way of organizing our culture has been dominant. But still, we throw pennies into wells today. So again, we may feel a deep attraction and satisfaction with this poem that may have been intended to be transcribed onto an object in that way. It's taken, I would say, 2,000 years for us to catch up with Simius. And that is despite half the world's languages being in danger of extinction, and many of those languages have pictographic scripts, and many of them don't have scripts at all. Of course, they are oral, and we think about this in terms of poetry as a development because we now have a major dominant form of poetry, which is performance poetry, which takes place often without a script. And this perhaps is returning us to earlier modes of creating and sharing poetry. We are also living in an age in which visual language is becoming far more appreciated. If we think of BSL, for example. Recently, John Berger, the artist and critic, he wrote a hugely influential book called Ways of Seeing. And he begins that book by saying, seeing comes before words. Simius gives us seeing and words, of course, and the beginnings of the genre of visual poetry. So magic, ritual, votive offerings, perhaps, the unity of word and image. Nothing could be further away from the culture that Simius worked in. It was, as I say, the beginnings of the Alexandrian library. Papyrus scroll, writing were dominant. As a grammarian, Simius worked the same as other grammarians, studying across criticism and reading very, very closely the great texts that had come before, such as Homer's Odyssey. Grammar wasn't quite what we think of it today. To these ancient Greek grammarians, it would involve scrutinizing an ancient text, decontextualizing sentences and studying them very, very closely, often to reveal perhaps a hidden meaning behind the texts. And it was that restoration of the study of the classics, which was very, very important to them. So why would Simius have been tempted to do something different? Well, perhaps close study of ancient texts fed in, as many creatives will confirm, fed into his artistic practice. Frustratingly, nothing is left of Simius's grammatical works. We do have some anecdotes written down for what he was interested in as a grammarian. But does he, as a grammarian, want to say something about the freedom of language? Does he want to break through the strict notion of how words should be presented on a papyrus scroll? It's also worth noting the radical meter of the poem here. You can see how the lines reduce towards its center and then open out towards its end. So there are less stressed beats to the lines as it develops over its quite short 12 lines. You know, so he's also shattering really the dominance of regular forms such as hexameter that dominated for the Alexandrian school. The poets of this time were interested in epic and elegy, and they're often dealing with history, for example, but they're also very, very often didactic, telling you something you should know or you should do. Simius wrote poems in those ways as well. I think it's important to note he wasn't bound by one form as a poet, and he may have wrote some quite conventional hymnic poems as well. It's interesting, I think, to think about what Simius did as a grammarian, what we are told that he was interested in, because he was interested, and this is very, very pertinent to me being from Liverpool, he was interested in dialect. We know he wrote about a particular Cretan word, whetstone, and he was interested in taking his obscurities, obscure regional words, and giving them the attention that was being given to the classics. So he was working away from the standardization of language in a way, just as this poem is working away from the standardization of a poem. And as with other grammarians, he would have looked at Homer. It was the big author that everyone was scrutinizing. Homer, of course, was blind, so he would not have been able to see Sirius's poem. But Homer was incredible for his dense imagery. One of the most famous is his use of the phrase rosy-fingered dawn for the sun coming up. So in Simius's creative mind, why not take an image like that further and make it physical? So this can be viewed as an experiment about the fluidity and abstract nature of language, perhaps, but also in its resistance of a fixed meaning, leaning towards something perhaps more utilitarian, something that can be shared and defined by users or readers themselves. So this is really close to what's happening on Instagram, for example, and we'll come to that later. Many poets create poetry objects these days, which has something very akin, I think, to what Simius was trying to achieve here. We expect these days poets to work across numerous forms. Poetry publishers look for manuscripts with many forms in them. Poets experiment and invent and try out different things within the same space. So I think Simius is a luminary for this generation poets. And the question perhaps is not so much why did Simius work in so many fields and write in so many styles? The question for me would be, why did not more poets of the Alexandrian school invent in the way that Simius did? I'm just going to move on now to talk about the influence or the following impact, if you like, of this particular poem. Shortly after Simius wrote this, there was an explosion of visual poems from other Greek scholars. And then there was nothing between Greece from about 200 BC to around 600 AD, 800 years without any surviving at least visual poems. Simius himself has had an afterlife as a poet. This is one of his other visual poems called The Egg, which was reprinted in this particular form in the medieval period. So some 1500 years later, the work of Simius is connecting with people, is being reimagined, reinvented, and reformed, if you like, with these extra images surrounding them. His work pervades and did so and has continued to do so through the millennia. If you look at this next version, this is a 1640 version of Simius's poem. And as you can see, this has been printed in its true form because it should look like a pair of wings, and it does look like a pair of wings. Quite radical, I think, to see it as it was meant to be, and as Simius meant it to be, because you might associate an image like this with Photoshop or with some kind of web editing technology, but this was originally from papyrus scroll. Elizabethans connecting with it, making it new. And in fact, one of the most famous of English poets, George Herbert, wrote a poem called Easter Wings, just around this very, very period. So there's no doubting that George Herbert was influenced by Simius when you look at this particular famous English poem. And this, again, is laid out how George Herbert intended, pretty much lifted, I think, straight from Simius's invention. If you look through the annals of history and the widespread of geography, what we also find is in a poem like this by Su Hui from the 4th century AD. I put BC on there, but it's actually AD. We can see that the visual poem was having its own life in different languages and different cultures. And I wanted to include, in the spirit of the Polygon Festival, a number of different scripts and a number of different languages. This would have been created almost definitely without knowledge of Simius's poem, because culture was not the way we have it today. Papyrus scroll was not being shifted to Second Dynasty China. So I want to come back to this idea of Dick Higgins's, that these works are being created because we have a need to see them. They come from a deep wish within us to combine the textual and the visual. And Su Hui was the wife of a court official, and she made the following love poem or lament for her husband, who was having many affairs with many different women, and she wanted to plead to him not to do that. And it's been muted, this particular poem, the way it works across its form can be read in 40,000 different ways. Now, quite quickly, I want to just move through some more examples so we can just think about this idea of different cultures inventing their own versions of the visual poem, because it allows something to be said that other forms could not reach or touch. This one is a Japanese block print by Kinamoto Hitamaro, who lived 7th century roughly, and this print is much later. But here we can see the words drifting down the page to the figure of the poet, and the poet's body is actually made up of more Japanese characters, so the language becomes the body of the poet. This one is a Russian harp by Simeon of Polotsk, 17th century. He was a Baroque poet of Belarusian descent. He was quite formal in many ways, a bit like Simius was, but he also created this quite wonderful visual poem in the shape of a heart. And we started thinking about love with Simius and what the visual poem might say of love. And of course, we see this coming through this particular work as well. As we do in these Burmese Lily Bud poems from the early 19th century. Very, very similar form to Simeon of Polotsk work. Um, and again, there is no likelihood that the Burmese poets had seen Simeon's work. It comes out of a need to create forms in every single language in all these different periods of history. Now, I want to think about what Simius's poem says about love, because that's what my book is about. No Love Is Not Dead. It's full of love poems from around the world, with writing about what these poems mean and how they can be interpreted. And the book starts with a foreword from Laura Tohe, who's the Navajo Nation Poet Laureate. And she talks about how the culture of Eros, the idea of the baby with the arrow and wings, that Simius writes about, is very, very alien to Navajo customs and culture. She asks, for a Navajo person, they might think, how can babies have wings? Are they supernatural? And why shoot arrows to make people fall in love? So our founding myth of love in the Western canon, one that's so prevalent in pop songs and Valentine's cards, is extremely strange when you stop to think about it. And unlike his contemporaries, Simius did stop to think about it. So what's going on in Wings? It's a first-person narration, spoken in the voice of Eros. It depicts the love god as the son of Achman. And although this claim is not largely upheld by scholars, it makes sense because Achman was associated with the anvil, a symbol of creation. In this poem, one quickly senses that Eros is a shapeshifter, perhaps an inventor of his own genesis, as he maintains that he is in fact the son of Cyprus, Aphrodite, and the war god Ares. This claim to Eros's parentage goes against that of the Phaedrus, who in the Symposium claims that love has no parents and none are ascribed to him by prose writers or poets. So Simius would have been aware of these debates about whether Eros had parents or not. And clearly he has his own view of it, because he says that Eros was born when chaos ruled and beings were forced to maintain distance. So an image that foreshadows the coronavirus, perhaps. Here, Eros is depicted as a boy, but one with a beard, who fuses together two principles of love. Firstly, that love is willful and impulsive, and secondly, that love, despite its youth, has its own wisdom, which time will prove to be true. Eros tells us here that while other gods force their will, he simply is, a being as natural as the elements, and this is how he took his place among the gods, through gentle-willed persuasion. And in modern editions, you will move the poem 90 degrees and you will see it take flight, as it does in this version, from 1640, with the wings soaring upwards, leaving almost vapor trails behind them. It is a poem of movement, and one in which Eros is captured. The poet Anne Carson says that Eros forces people through desire to melt, break down, bite into, burn, devour, wear away, whirl around, sting, pierce, wound, poison, suffocate, drag off, or grind the lover to a powder. Very few see him coming. Simius engages us with all of these ideas, and he does it in a way that allows us to interpret that for ourselves. It's also worth considering whether Simius had in mind the Greek custom of pederasty, which was not so prevalent by the time Simius wrote his poem. But this idea of the older male and the younger male becoming lovers, because Simius, of course, pictures Eros with a plentiful crop of beard on his chin. So we can take the poem as historical and rooted in its time, but also quite fluid and easily translatable into all these different periods of history and into our current moment. It's also worth thinking, I think, about where we are right now with the integration of word and image. So we're very used to emoticons, perhaps one of the most easily recognizable and translatable images across the world, across phones and social media, etc., etc. It could be said that at last the apotheosis, if you like, of this idea of the word and image integrating has happened. We are living in this particular moment now. We communicate through visual language in a way that Simius could only have imagined. This moment was developed or fed into by the concrete poetry movement in the 1950s. And this is one of the most famous poems from that time by Eugen Gomringer. It's called Silencio. And it works through this 14 repetitions of the word silencio, a word everyone could understand or guess its meaning. And right at the center is a gap where space stands in for the meaning of the word silence. So word and image become one. The visuality speaks for the meaning of the poem and vice versa. And Gomringer had a very clear idea of what visual poetry should be doing after the Second World War and the hollowing out of language by the Nazi Party and various other fascists. And that was that poems could become simple. In his view, he says poems should be, if possible, as easily understood as signs in airports or traffic signs. So there's this idea that if we can make poems that are so simple in their visuality and their language that we don't need translation anymore, and we don't need to rely on interpretation of other people's words to understand what they might mean. So it's a very, very pressing idea which is fed into our current understanding of how word and image aligns. And I'm going to finish just by saying, where do we see this so clearly as in Instagram? It is quite a movement from Simias of Rhodes to end with Instagram. But of course, it again sets out to connect with people in the way that Simius wanted to connect with people through the integration of text and image. And in poetry, we have seen an explosion in this medium. Famously, Rupi Kaur wrote a book called Milk and Honey, which is sold over 1.5 million copies. If you search the hashtag visual poetry on Instagram, there are over 500,000 posts, thousands of them expressing love in some form and in many, many different languages. And we have visual poets such as Anatol Knotek, who makes poetry objects. So this is his work called Ego, visual poem called Ego that happens to be an object, connecting perhaps with this idea of Simius, that the poem should be made to be transcribed onto an object and made an offering to the gods. Well, society's moved on from a magical period through to religious, through science to the moment, but poets and artists still want to create objects out of words and present them to someone. In this case, the ego. Perhaps the ego has replaced God in some sense in this particular work. Anatol's work influences people to have tattoos made of his poems. You can see this is one of the most popular. Someone's had his poem Time Passes By. So visual poems are now painted, if you like, onto the body, which is quite an interesting adaptation or development of where Simius began. And to finish with this work, I think because it says something about the celebration and the excitement that we have for visual poetry now that was not there when Simius created his. And this is another work by Anatol. in which the problem has become the poem. And I think Simius may have created a problem for the Greek Academy with his unclassifiable work, but we can now accept and enjoy it simply as the poem. Thank you for listening. You can find out more about Simius' poem in No Love Is Not Dead, along with 50 other poems from different languages around the world. And that is available from Chambers, and it's out now. But thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of the Polygon online festival, and I will hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.